The church bell had barely finished its 6th chime when a starving boy's hand closed around a heel of bread. His sister coughed at the door, thin, hollow, desperate, and when Jake Brennan laid a silver coin on the counter, he didn't know he was buying more than bread. He was buying a choice that would change 3 lives forever. But why would a lone cowboy risk everything for 2 strangers with nothing? "That'll be 15 cents, Mrs. Kettering said without looking up. The boy's hand froze on the bread. His eyes darted to his sister, then to the door, measuring distances like a trapped animal. Jake had seen that look before on mustangs backed into box canyons, on men with empty pockets facing winter. "I don't," the boy started. "Got mice in your pocket?" Mrs. Kettering's pencil stopped moving. She turned, her pale eyes taking in the boy's patched shirt, the holes in his boots, then put it back. The boy's grip on the bread tightened. His sister coughed again, a wet sound that seemed to echo off the bakery's tin ceiling. Outside, the morning stage rattled past, wheels drumming against the frozen ruts. Jake stepped forward, the floorboards creaking under his boots. "I'll take care of it." Mrs. Kettering's eyebrows climbed toward her hairline. The boy looked up at Jake with suspicious eyes the color of creek water. "Don't need charity," he said, but his voice cracked on the words. 15 cents for the bread," Jake said, placing a silver quarter on the counter. The coin rang against the wood like a small bell. "Keep the change, Mrs. Kettering." The boy clutched the bread to his chest, but he didn't move toward the door. "Why?" Jake glanced at the little girl who had stopped coughing and was watching them with wide eyes. Her doll's remaining corn-silk hair caught the morning light like spun gold. "Had a sister once," he said. "No, how it is." The boy's throat worked as he swallowed. "Much obliged, Mr." They were almost to the door when Mrs. Kettering called out, "You boy, what's your name?" "Tommy. Tommy Walsh." "And the little one?" "Sarah." The boy's arm went around his sister's shoulders, protective as a wing. "She's all I got." Mrs. Kettering made another scratch in her ledger. The sound was sharp in the quiet bakery. "Where you staying?" Tommy's shoulders tensed. "We got a place. That old dugout by Miller's Creek?" Mrs. Kettering's voice was dry as week old biscuits. "That's no place for winter." The stage horn sounded from the depot, 3 long blasts that meant the Denver run was loading. Tommy pulled Sarah closer, and Jake saw how the boy's free hand went to his pocket, checking for something that wasn't there. "We'll manage," Tommy said. Jake watched them walk away, the boy's hand steady on his sister's shoulder despite the tremor in his voice. Sarah's corn-husk doll bounced with each step, its remaining hair streaming behind like a banner. Mrs. Kettering clicked her tongue. "Those children got no business living rough. Winter comes early this year. I can smell it in the wind." Jake nodded, his eyes still on the bakery window where Tommy and Sarah had disappeared around the corner toward the creek. The quarter had left a small dent in his traveling money, but he'd spent worse coins on worse causes. Still, something about the way the boy had looked at his sister like she was the only thing worth protecting in all the world stuck in his chest like a burr. The church bell chimed the half-hour, and Jake realized he'd been standing there long enough for Mrs. Kettering to finish her figuring. She was watching him now with the sharp attention she usually reserved for her scales and measures. "You heading out on the stage?" she asked. That was the plan. Jake touched his hat brim. "Good day, ma'am." But as he stepped onto the boardwalk, the morning wind carried the sound of Sarah's cough from somewhere down by the creek. The stage was warming its team in front of Murphy's Hotel, black smoke rising from the engine-house chimney like a promise of distance and warm towns ahead. Jake looked toward the creek, then back at the stage. The driver was checking his harness, and passengers were already climbing aboard a drummer with a sample case, a lady in a green traveling dress, an old man with a beard that reached his watch chain. The bread heel had cost 15 cents. A stage ticket to Denver ran $3.40. But some arithmetic, Jake was learning, didn't balance the way a man expected. He walked toward Miller's Creek instead of Murphy's Hotel. Behind him, the stage horn sounded again, impatient as hunger. The dugout sat in a stand of cottonwoods where the creek bent south, half buried in the hillside like a root cellar. Someone had chinked the gaps between the logs with mud and grass, but the work was rough, done by small hands without proper tools. Smoke trickled from a tin chimney that listed to one side like a broken finger. Jake paused at the top of the creek bank, listening. Inside the dugout, Sarah was coughing again, and he could hear Tommy's voice, soft and urgent, trying to soothe her. The sound carried on the thin air like a prayer. A magpie scolded him from a nearby branch, its black and white feathers bright against the yellow cottonwood leaves. October in Colorado Territory could turn mean without warning. Jake had seen snow by Halloween that didn't melt until April. The dugout might keep out rain, but it wouldn't hold heat worth a damn. He made his way down the bank, his boots slipping on the frost-slick grass. A stack of creek stones marked where someone had tried to build a proper chimney foundation, but the work had been abandoned half done. Beside the door a bucket sat under a dripping eave, collecting water one slow drop at a time. Jake knocked 3 soft raps that wouldn't startle anyone inside. The talking stopped. Footsteps shuffled across what sounded like a dirt floor, and then Tommy's voice came through the door, cautious as a deer at a salt lick. "Who's there?" "Jake Brennan." From the bakery. The door opened a crack, revealing one of Tommy's creek-water eyes. "What you want?" "To talk." The door opened wider, and Jake got his first look inside the dugout. It was smaller than a horse stall, with barely room for a man to stand upright. Sarah lay on a pallet made of old blankets, the corn-husk doll tucked under her arm. Her cheeks were flushed with fever, and each breath seemed to cost her more effort than the last. A small fire burned in a ring of stones, fed by twigs and creek drift. The smoke that didn't escape through the chimney hung in the air like regret. "She took sick 3 days ago," Tommy said, following Jake's gaze. "Started as sniffles, but it's gotten worse." Jake crouched beside the pallet. Sarah's eyes were bright with fever, but she managed a small smile when she saw him. Her corn-husk doll was missing more hair than before, just a few strands now clinging to its head like hope. "What's your doll's name?" Jake asked. "Cordelia." Sarah's voice was a whisper. "Tommy made her for me." Jake looked at Tommy, who was standing by the door like he might bolt at any second. The boy's hands were rough for his age, marked with small cuts and calluses that spoke of hard work and harder living. "You did good work on her," Jake said. Tommy's shoulders relaxed a fraction. Used to help Pa with leather work, before he didn't finish the sentence, but the weight of whatever came after hung in the smoky air. Sarah started coughing again, a sound that seemed to come from her toes. Tommy was beside her in an instant, lifting her shoulders so she could breathe easier. When the fit passed, she lay back down with her eyes closed, exhausted. "She needs medicine," Tommy said, his voice barely controlled. "Dr. Hendricks has laudanum and such, but it costs—" He stopped, his jaw working. "More than I got." Jake had seen enough frontier medicine to know that laudanum might ease the pain, but it wouldn't cure what was eating at Sarah's lungs. What she needed was warmth, good food, and a place where the wind didn't cut through the walls like a knife. The fire was burning low, and Tommy moved to feed it more twigs. Each piece was carefully chosen, as if fuel was precious as gold, which, Jake realized, it probably was. "How long you been living here?" Jake asked. "Since August." Tommy's voice was steady, but Jake caught the tremor underneath. "Pa died of the lung fever in Pueblo. Took what we could carry and came north, looking for work. Find any?" Tommy shrugged. "Some. Swept floors at the Mercantile until Mr. Patterson said he couldn't afford help anymore. Mucked stalls at the livery until the stable-master caught me sleeping in the hay. He poked at the fire with a green stick, sending sparks up the makeshift chimney. Been doing odd jobs since splitting kindling, carrying water, whatever folks need doing." Jake did the arithmetic in his head. 2 children living rough since August, surviving on whatever Tommy could earn with his 10-year-old hands. It was a miracle they'd made it this far, and a crueler miracle that they probably wouldn't make it much further. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the cottonwood leaves like coins in a pocket. The dugout's door shivered in its frame, and Jake saw how Tommy had wedged it shut with a chunk of creek stone. "Winter's coming," Jake said. Tommy nodded without looking up from the fire. "I know." "You got family anywhere? Relatives who might take you in?" Got an uncle in Kansas, maybe. Pa mentioned him once. Tommy's voice was carefully neutral. But I don't know where exactly, and we got no money for train fare anyway. Sarah stirred on her pallet, mumbling something in her fever sleep. Tommy was beside her again, smoothing her hair back from her forehead with a gentleness that made Jake's chest tight. "She's all you got," Jake said, remembering the boy's words from the bakery. "And I'm all she's got." Tommy looked up, and for a moment his face was older than his years. "I know what you're thinking, mister. That we can't make it. That she's going to." He stopped, unable to say the words. Jake stood, his head brushing the dugout's low ceiling. Through the single window, a piece of oiled paper stretched over a wooden frame, he could see the creek running slow and dark between its banks. Soon it would freeze. And then, where would they get water? How would they keep warm when the real cold came? The kind that turned breath to ice and made the wind sound like wolves. What if there was another way? Jake said. Tommy's eyes sharpened. "What do you mean?" Jake pulled out his traveling roll, $43 in bills and coin, enough to get him to Denver and maybe beyond. It wasn't a fortune, but it was more than these children had seen in months. I mean, what if you didn't have to do it alone? Tommy stood too, his hands clenched at his sides. "I told you before. We don't need charity." Not talking about charity. Jake put the money away, but he kept his eyes on Tommy's face. Talking about family. The word hung between them like smoke from the dying fire. Outside, a cow lowed somewhere up the valley, the sound lonely and distant. Sarah coughed in her sleep, and Tommy's jaw tightened with each rasp. "You don't know us," Tommy said finally. "No," Jake agreed. "But I know about being alone. Know about watching someone you love get sicker while you count pennies and pray for miracles." He paused, remembering another fever, another child who couldn't stop coughing. Know about losing them anyway. Tommy was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on his sister's face. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "What are you saying?" Jake moved to the window, looking out at the creek where ice was already forming along the shallow edges. A few months from now, this whole valley would be locked in winter's grip, white and silent as a grave. "I'm saying maybe there's room for 3 on the next stage south." Tommy's head came up. "South?" "Texas. I got a piece of land down there, nothing fancy, but the house is solid and there's good water." Jake turned back to face the boy. "Place could use a family." The words came out rougher than he'd intended, but Tommy didn't seem to notice. He was staring at Jake like a man stares at a mirage, afraid to believe it's real. "You're talking about adoption," Tommy said. "I'm talking about signing papers that say you and Sarah are my responsibility. Legal-like." Jake pulled out a folded document from his vest pocket, a will that needed updating anyway. "Got to see a lawyer about this anyway. Wouldn't be much trouble to add a codicil." Sarah made a small sound, and both men looked toward the pallet. She was awake, her fever-bright eyes moving between them like she was following a conversation in a foreign language. "Tommy," she whispered. He was beside her in 2 steps. "Right here, Sarah. Just talking with Mr. Brennan." She looked at Jake, her gaze surprisingly steady for a child so sick. "Are you the man who bought our bread?" "Yes, ma'am." "Tommy said you had a sister, too." Jake's throat tightened. "Long time ago." Sarah nodded solemnly, as if this explained everything. What happened to her? The question hit Jake like a physical blow. He saw Tommy tense, ready to scold his sister for asking something so personal, but Jake held up a hand. "She got sick," Jake said simply, "like you. But we didn't have anywhere warm to take her, and I wasn't old enough to know what to do." He paused, the words coming harder now. "Lost her to a fever when she was about your age." Sarah considered this, her small fingers working at her doll's remaining hair. "I'm sorry," she said. "Me too." Jake looked at Tommy, who was watching him with new understanding. "Been sorry for 23 years." The dugout fell quiet, except for the pop and hiss of the dying fire. Outside, the wind was picking up, carrying the smell of snow from the high peaks. Winter was coming, whether they were ready or not. "The stage south leaves tomorrow morning," Jake said. "If we're going to do this, we need to move fast." Tommy's hand found Sarah's, and Jake saw the moment when the boy made his decision. It was there in the straightening of his shoulders. The way his chin came up despite the fear in his eyes. "What would we have to do?" Tommy asked. "Get Sarah to Doc Hendricks first thing. Get her some real medicine, not just hope and creek water." Jake pulled out his money roll again, this time peeling off a $5 bill. "Then we go see Judge Morrison. He can draw up the papers." Tommy stared at the money like it might disappear if he blinked. "And after that?" "After that, we get on the stage to Texas. Find out what it's like to be a family." Sarah started coughing again, but this time Tommy didn't move to help her right away. Instead, he looked at Jake with something that might have been the beginning of trust. "Why?" Tommy asked. "Why would you do this for us?" Jake thought about lying, about giving some easy answer that wouldn't cost him anything. But something in the boy's eyes, the same fierce protectiveness he'd shown in the bakery, demanded honesty. "Because 23 years ago, nobody did it for me and mine," Jake said, "and I've been carrying that weight ever since." The fire collapsed into embers, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. Sarah's coughing fit passed, leaving her pale and exhausted against the makeshift pillow. Outside, the first snowflakes of winter began to fall, tapping against the oiled paper window like tiny fingers. Tommy looked at his sister, then at Jake, then back at Sarah. When he spoke, his voice was steady as bedrock. "All right," he said. "All right, we'll try it." Jake nodded, surprised by the relief that flooded through him. "Better get packed. We've got a long day ahead of us." As Tommy began gathering their few possessions, Jake stepped outside into the falling snow. The flakes were small and hard, driven by a wind that promised serious weather before nightfall. By tomorrow, this whole valley would be white and silent, and the creek would start its long freeze toward spring. But tomorrow, if things went according to plan, they'd be on the southbound stage with their backs to winter and their faces turned toward something warmer. Jake pulled his coat closer and headed back into the dugout to help them pack. Behind him, his boots left tracks in the snow that were already beginning to fill. The next morning found them in Judge Morrison's office above the Mercantile, watching the old man's pen scratch across legal paper. The judge's spectacles sat crooked on his nose, and he paused every few words to squint at what he'd written, as if the law might change while he wasn't looking. Sarah sat in Jake's lap, wrapped in a blanket that smelled of the laudanum Doc Hendricks had given her. The medicine had eased her cough enough that she could sleep, but her fever was still high. Every few minutes she would stir and mumble something about her doll, which Tommy had tucked carefully into their travel bundle. "Says here you want to adopt both children," Judge Morrison said, his pen hovering over the paper. "That's a considerable responsibility, Mr. Brennan." "Yes, sir." "You got means to support them? Place to live?" Jake pulled out the deed to his Texas property, 200 acres of good grazing land, with a house that had weathered 15 winters without complaint. The judge studied it with the attention he usually reserved for criminal cases. "Fair Creek, Texas," the judge read aloud. "Know anything about that country?" "Lived there 7 years. Good water, mild winters, close enough to town for schooling." Jake shifted Sarah's weight, feeling how light she was, even for a 7-year-old. "They'll do better there than here." The judge made a note in the margin of the document, his pen scratching like a mouse in the walls. Outside, the snow was falling harder now, and Jake could see Tommy watching it through the office window with worried eyes. "You understand this makes them legally your children?" Judge Morrison said. "Same as if they were born to you. Their debts become your debts, their troubles become your troubles." "I understand. And if something happens to you, they inherit according to law. Could be a considerable sum, given this property." Jake nodded, though he hadn't thought much about inheritance. The land was worth something, but its real value was in what it could provide: shelter, security, a place where children could grow up without measuring their lives in 15-cent loaves of bread. The judge finished writing and sanded the ink to dry it. When he looked up, his eyes were serious behind the crooked spectacles. "This ain't something you can undo easy, son. Adoption papers are binding as marriage vows." "Good," Jake said. "That's the point." Judge Morrison smiled for the first time since they'd entered his office. "In that case, congratulations. You're officially a family." He reached for his seal and pressed it into the warm wax at the bottom of the document. "Take this to the depot. Stage master will want to see it when you buy the children's tickets." Tommy had been quiet through the whole proceeding, but now he stepped forward. "Judge, what about our pa's debts? He owed money in Pueblo when he died." "Your pa's debts died with him, son. Clean slate from here on." The judge handed the papers to Jake, but he looked at Tommy when he spoke. "You're Jake Brennan's boy now, legal and proper." They made their way down the stairs and out into the falling snow, Tommy carrying their bundle while Jake carried Sarah. The little girl was awake now, her fever-bright eyes taking in the busy street-scene horses stamping in the cold, shopkeepers sweeping snow from their boardwalks, the stage loading passengers for the southbound run. "That's our stage," Jake said, nodding toward the mud-splattered coach where the driver was checking his team one final time. Sarah lifted her head from Jake's shoulder. "Will Cordelia be warm enough?" "Your doll?" Jake looked at Tommy, who was patting the bundle to make sure everything was secure. "I think she'll be fine. We'll keep her close." The stage master took their tickets and examined the adoption papers with the thoroughness of a man who'd seen his share of questionable documents. When he handed them back, he was smiling. "Family rate applies," he said, counting out change from Jake's payment. "2 adults, 1 child. Save you 4 bits." They climbed aboard to find the coach half full, a merchant heading to Denver, a young couple who whispered to each other in what sounded like German, and an elderly woman with a carpet bag full of knitting. The woman looked up when Sarah coughed and immediately began rearranging seats to give them more room. "Poor little lamb," she murmured, pulling a hand-knitted scarf from her bag. "Here, this will help keep the wind off." As the stage pulled away from Fairplay, Jake looked back at the town through the small rear window. Snow was already covering their tracks, and the dugout by Miller's Creek was lost behind a curtain of white. By evening, it would be just another bump in the landscape, with no sign that 2 children had spent the hardest months of their lives there. Tommy sat across from him, staring out at the passing countryside, with the intense attention of someone seeing the world change. When Sarah fell asleep again, lulled by the stage's rocking motion, Tommy leaned forward. "Mr. Brennan, what's it like in Texas?" Jake thought about the question, trying to find words for the place that had been his refuge for 7 years. "Warmer," he said finally. "Longer growing season. You can plant a garden in March and harvest through November." "We never had a garden," Tommy said. "Always lived in town." "We'll learn together." Jake adjusted the scarf around Sarah's neck, tucking it close to keep out the draft. House came with fruit trees, peach and apple. Previous owner planted them before he moved on. The German couple was sharing bread and cheese from a basket, and the smell made Tommy's stomach growl audibly. The elderly woman with the knitting looked up and immediately began unwrapping a package of her own. "Growing boys need feeding," she said, handing Tommy a thick sandwich of ham and bread. "Go on, take it. I packed more than I can eat." Tommy looked at Jake, who nodded. The boy bit into the sandwich like he was afraid it might disappear, and Jake realized it was probably the first real meal he'd had in days. As they rolled south through the afternoon, the snow gradually thinned and then stopped altogether. By evening they were in country where the grass was still green and the cottonwoods held their leaves. Sarah woke as they pulled into Colorado Springs for the night, alert enough to take some broth at the hotel dining room. "Feeling better?" Jake asked. She nodded, though her cheeks were still flushed with fever. "Cordelia likes traveling," she said, holding up her cornhusk doll. "She says Texas sounds nice." "What else does Cordelia say?" Tommy asked, settling into the chair beside his sister's bed. "She says it's good to have a family." The words were simple, spoken in a 7-year-old's matter-of-fact voice, but they hit Jake with unexpected force. For the first time since leaving Fairplay, he allowed himself to believe that this might actually work, that 3 strangers thrown together by circumstance and need might somehow become the things Sarah had named. 2 weeks later, they stood on the porch of the house in Fair Creek, watching Tommy chase chickens around the yard while Sarah sat in a rocking chair, her cornhusk doll in her lap, and her cheeks pink with health instead of fever. The laudanum was long gone, replaced by fresh air, good food, and the kind of sleep that comes when you're not afraid of tomorrow. "She's gained weight," Jake said, more to himself than to anyone else. Tommy looked up from his chicken chasing, grinning in a way that made him look like the 10-year-old he actually was. Doc Peterson says her lungs are clear, says the dry air down here is good medicine. Jake nodded, watching Sarah rock gently in the chair he'd bought in town the week before. The corn husk doll had new hair, now yellow yarn, that Tommy had carefully braided into place. It wasn't as fine as the original corn silk, but it was bright and cheerful, and Sarah had declared it an improvement. The adoption papers were framed and hanging in the kitchen, next to a photograph they'd had taken at the general store. In the picture, all three of them were stiffly posed and formally dressed, but if you looked close, you could see Sarah's small hand resting on Jake's knee, and Tommy's shoulders straight with something that might have been pride. A letter had come from Kansas. Word had somehow reached Tommy's uncle about their situation. He'd written to say he was glad the children were settled, and that he'd been wondering about them since he heard about his brother's death. There was no mention of taking them in, no suggestion that they might have been welcome there. Jake had burned the letter without showing it to Tommy, but he'd kept the uncle's address, just in case. The sun was setting over the peach trees, painting the sky the color of ripe fruit. In a few weeks it would be time for harvest, and Jake was looking forward to teaching Tommy how to judge ripeness, how to handle the fruit so it wouldn't bruise. Simple knowledge, the kind that passed from father to son without ceremony or fuss. Sarah started coughing, just a small, dry cough that cleared quickly, but both Jake and Tommy looked toward her with sharp attention, the old fear never quite gone. She smiled and waved the corn-husk doll at them. "I'm fine," she said. "Cordelia says you worry too much." Jake laughed, surprised by the sound. When had he started laughing again? When had the weight he'd carried for 23 years begun to feel lighter? That night, after Tommy and Sarah were asleep, Jake sat on the porch with a cup of coffee and watched the stars come out over Texas. Somewhere up north, snow was probably falling on an empty dugout by Miller's Creek. Somewhere behind him, 2 children were dreaming in beds that belonged to them, in a house that was theirs by law and love. Tomorrow, Tommy would help him repair the fence around the vegetable garden. Sarah would play with her doll in the shade of the apple trees. They would eat meals together, work together, argue about chores and bedtimes and all the ordinary troubles of family life. It wasn't the family any of them had been born to, but it was the one they'd chosen. And sometimes, Jake was learning, that made all the difference. The boy had stolen bread for his sister. The cowboy had paid the bakery and signed them family. And in the arithmetic that mattered most, the accounts were finally balanced. If something in this story touched you, linger with us. We'll handle the rest.